The Galactic Council gathered to condemn humanity, expecting to find a species begging for mercy. Instead, they found 12 empty chairs where human ambassadors should have been. Dr. Yenna Morse's final transmission played across the chamber. "You speak of evidence, but my people have never been allowed to defend themselves." The Council's vote to lock humanity away had come too late. Earth was already gone. But where did 15 billion humans disappear to, and what dangerous new form had they become? Ambassador Krell's scaled fingers tapped the console. Silence fell across the 1,000-tiered galactic chamber. The central hologram ignited, bathing the assembled delegates in shifting blue light. He began with a calm, methodical tone that carried to the furthest rows. For 10 standard years, the humans had pushed boundaries. Krell laid out each transgression like a prosecutor building an inescapable case. The hologram flickered, displaying evidence. A human freighter drifting through the Xylos Nebula, a zone designated off-limits after the Farron plague outbreak. Sensor logs showed they ignored 7 hails and 2 warning shots. The image shifted. A desert world, now showing patches of green. Unauthorized terraforming, altering a planet under ecological observation. Next, cultural contamination. Footage of human media traders on Keswick Prime, distributing entertainment that caused civil unrest among the worker caste. Krell's voice remained level, but his dorsal spine stiffened. He acknowledged the past. Humanity's assistance during the Cygnus black hole incident was noted. Their medical technology had saved millions during the Vexian flu pandemic. But past aid, he stated, did not grant a license for present chaos. The pattern was clear, deliberate, dangerous. His final words on the matter cut through the chamber. Their pattern of behavior shows deliberate disregard for cosmic law. Delegates shifted in their seats. The insectoid Xantharian's antennae twitched in unison, a sign of deep anxiety. The chromatophores of the aquatic Gelthar delegates flashed rapid, worried patterns across their skin. Fear was a silent current moving through the room. The evidence was overwhelming. The defendant was absent. The vote commenced. It was a mechanical, grim process. Each species representative activated their terminal. A series of lights flashed green around the circular chamber. Approval, approval, approval. There were no abstentions. No objections. The weight of collective judgment settled over them all. The verdict was pronounced. Humanity was henceforth barred from all galactic society. All trade agreements were void. All diplomatic ties severed. All interspecies friendships officially condemned. The decree echoed from the sound systems, a final, formal pronouncement of exile. As the words faded, the only sound was the low hum of the chamber's life support. And there they were, the 12 seats reserved for the human delegation. They sat empty, arranged in a shallow arc. The chairs were simple, unadorned, identical to all the others. But their emptiness was a louder statement than any defense could have been. They were a void at the heart of the proceedings, a silent testament to the fact that the galaxy was judging a species that had not even bothered to show up for its own trial. The Council had acted with full authority, but they had been arguing with a ghost. The empty chairs became the focal point. In the sea of occupied seats, those 12 vacancies stood out. They were not a subtle absence. They were a hole in the proceedings. The silence from that section was louder than Krell's accusations. Council security had been monitoring approach vectors for days. Their report came in now, a quiet data packet to each senior delegate. A single line of text, repeated. No human. Vessel signatures detected within 5 light-years of the station for 3 standard cycles. No arrival notifications. No pending requests for docking clearance. Nothing. The station's long-range sensors had swept the space lanes. They found no sign of the human diplomatic convoy. They hadn't just failed to arrive for the verdict. They hadn't even started the journey. A low murmur began. It started with the delegates who had seen the security alert. Their voices were hushed. The word spread through the chamber. It moved from terminal to terminal, a wave of unease. Was this human arrogance a deliberate insult to the Council's authority? The thought was there, but so was another, something darker. Perhaps it was not defiance. Perhaps it was something else. The delegates from the Retic conglomerate leaned together, their feathered crests twitching. The delegation from the mineral-rich Tepler system exchanged long, silent looks. Ambassador Krell caught the shift in the chamber's atmosphere. He saw the glances toward the empty section. He dismissed it with a wave of a clawed hand. This was typical, he announced to the assembly. Typical human disregard for protocol. They had never respected ceremony. They saw rules as suggestions. Their absence was just another act of defiance, the final proof of their unsuitability for galactic society. He used their empty chairs as part of his closing argument. He pointed to them. See? They don't even care enough to face their judgment. His words were meant to settle the matter. For some, it did. For others, it raised more questions. The delegates from smaller, weaker systems watched the vacant spots. They did not see arrogance. They remembered the Cygnus black hole incident. They had been there. Their ships were caught in the gravitational shear. It was human engineering, human courage, that had created the stabilizing field that pulled them free. They recalled the Vexian flu. Human medical teams had arrived unasked, working until they dropped to contain the outbreak on their worlds. The silence from those chairs felt wrong. It didn't match the species they knew. The visual contrast was stark. The chamber was packed. 1,000 species were represented. Every seat was filled except those 12. It was a perfect image of inclusion and exclusion. The entire galaxy had gathered to cast out one member, and that member was not present to hear the sentence. The Council's internal protocols had a clause for this, judgment in absentia. The rules were clear. A refusal to attend a tribunal was itself an admission of guilt. The vote had been cast. The verdict was legal and binding. They proceeded. The gavel fell. Humanity's fate was sealed by a room of their peers while their chairs sat empty. This was the first mistake. The first clue that everyone missed. They assumed the absence was a choice, a political statement, an act of stubbornness. They did not consider that the chairs were empty for a far simpler, far more terrifying reason. There was no one left to sit in them. The Council had just outlawed a species that had already vanished from the galaxy. The chamber's silence shattered. Every terminal, every viewscreen, every personal comm device lit up at once. A hard, clear signal overrode all security protocols. It bypassed encryption layers, firewalls, and frequency blocks. There was no warning, no request for a channel. The transmission simply appeared. Dr. Yenna Morse's face filled the displays. Her image was sharp, stable. She looked directly into the chamber. Her eyes moved across the assembly as if she stood among them. There was no panic in her expression. No fear, only a calm, solid determination. She wore a simple environmental suit, no insignia or rank. Her hair was pulled back. She looked like someone who had been working, not preparing for a speech. Her voice came through clean, without echo. It carried no plea for mercy, no emotional appeal. It was a statement of fact. "You speak of evidence," she began, "but my people have never been allowed to defend ourselves." The words were not shouted. They were measured. They carried the weight of an undeniable truth. The Council had built its case without a single human voice present to offer context. She was providing it now. She addressed the accusations point by point. The freighter in the Xylos Nebula. It was not a violation. It was a rescue. A Xantharian scout ship had sent a distress call on a blocked emergency frequency after a drive failure. Human vessels were the only ones close enough to respond in time. They ignored the hails because they were running a medical evacuation under power constraints. They saved 17 lives. The warning shots were logged as unprovoked aggression by a jumpy border patrol. The unauthorized terraforming. The desert world was dying. Its single native species was suffering a genetic collapse due to a shifting magnetic field. Human teams stabilized the core, acting on a direct, though unofficial, request from the planet's own Science Council. The cultural contamination. The media traders were providing educational materials to a suppressed underclass, information that exposed systemic fraud by the ruling cartel. The unrest was not caused by human stories. It was caused by the truth. As she spoke, data streams flowed alongside her image. Ship logs, medical records, official communiques that had been lost in bureaucratic channels. Council security reacted. Their technicians tried to block the signal. They initiated countermeasures. They failed. The transmission was like water. It flowed around every obstacle. The data was there for anyone to see if they chose to look. Her final sentence landed in the sudden quiet. You judge what you fear rather than what you understand. Then the signal cut. The screens went dark. The abrupt return to the chamber's normal lighting was jarring. The silence that followed was different from before. It was charged, divided. Some delegates sat in stunned outrage at the breach of protocol. Their systems had been hacked. Their authority challenged. Others looked down at their terminals, at the data packets that had already been downloaded to their local systems. They felt the first prick of uncomfortable reflection. The evidence she presented was compelling. It painted a very different picture of the last decade. It suggested the Council had not been pursuing a rogue species. It had been persecuting a helpful one. Morse's defiance did not change the verdict. That was already sealed, but it did something more dangerous. It planted the first seed of doubt. The question was no longer whether humanity was guilty. The question became whether the Council had just made a catastrophic error. Alarms pulsed in the Council's deep space monitoring sector. A junior technician on the night watch was the first to see it. The readings from human-occupied space made no sense. He called his supervisor. The data stream showed massive dimensional fluctuations across dozens of systems. It wasn't weapons fire. It wasn't a containment field. The energy signatures were off the scale, but they followed a precise repeating pattern. They were coordinated. The supervisor ordered a full sensor diagnostic. The diagnostics came back clean. The readings were real. This was not destruction. The sensor data showed no explosions, no matter-antimatter annihilation signatures, no gamma-ray bursts from dying stars. This was something else. The energy was not tearing space apart. It was folding it. Ripples in the fabric of reality propagated from every human world, every station, every outpost. The pattern indicated translocation, not through space, through dimensions. The humans were not destroying their homes. They were moving them. The scale was incomprehensible. This was not a fleet evacuation. This was the relocation of an entire civilization. They called it the Exodus Protocol. It was humanity's ultimate contingency plan, a project decades in development. It was not born from paranoia but from observation. Human scientists had watched the galactic community for generations. They saw how it treated species that were different. They saw the pattern of fear leading to isolation, then to condemnation. They decided they would not wait for the noose to tighten. They would simply step off the gallows. Their research into dimensional physics had advanced far beyond galactic understanding. While other species built bigger warships, humanity built a door to a place where no one could follow. The protocol was activated. Across hundreds of light years, the same process unfolded. Massive field generators built into the crust of planets and the frames of space stations engaged simultaneously. They did not create wormholes. They performed a precise calculated shift. They moved their entire mass into an adjacent dimensional layer, a parallel reality where the fundamental laws of physics were slightly different. It was a place where conventional FTL travel did not function, where energy weapons might not fire. It was a universe next door, utterly inaccessible to any pursuit force the galaxy could muster. This was not an act of hiding. It was an act of relocation. They were not cowering in the dark. They were building a new home on the other side of a wall no one else could see or breach. The dimensional barriers they left behind were temporary. They were like the wake of a ship, smoothing out over time. Within hours of the transition completing, the pathways would close permanently. The space humanity once occupied would be just that, empty space. There would be no way to track them, no way to communicate, no way to wage war. The separation would be total and absolute. Humanity had chosen exile. They looked at the prospect of endless conflict, of sanctions, of being treated as a permanent threat within galactic society, and they made a calculation. The cost of staying was higher than the cost of leaving. They chose to remove themselves from the equation entirely. They would not fight. They would not negotiate. They would simply depart. Their disappearance was the final answer to every accusation. It was the ultimate statement on the galaxy's failure. The Council feared what it did not understand, so humanity went to a place beyond its understanding. They solved the problem by ceasing to be a part of it. Their empty chairs were not a symbol of defiance, but of a choice already made. The trial had been a postscript to a story that had already ended. Admiral Torvin's combined fleet dropped from FTL at the edge of the Sol system. 300 warships, a show of force assembled from a dozen compliant species. Their weapons were live. Shields were at full strength. Scanners swept the system looking for minefields, patrols, orbital defenses. They found nothing. No challenges. No warning shots. The system was silent. Torvin stood on the command deck of the flagship, his forearms crossed. He expected a fight. He expected a last stand. He expected something. The sensor officer's voice cut through the quiet hum of the bridge. "Admiral, readings are anomalous." The scans painted a picture that made no tactical sense. Earth's atmosphere showed ideal composition. Temperature norms were perfect. Oxygen levels, nitrogen, all within optimal human tolerances. But the biological scans came back blank. There were no life signs. Not a single human heartbeat registered across the entire planet. The data was rechecked. The results were the same. The planet was a perfect habitat, empty of its inhabitants. Torvin ordered a visual sweep. The main screen resolved on the day side of Earth. Cities stood intact. Skyscrapers reached for the sky. Lights glowed in windows. Traffic flowed through automated transit systems. Ground vehicles moved along roadways with no one inside them. It was a world frozen in a moment of perfect operation, with the operators removed. Orbital facilities were the same. Space stations maintained their positions. Docking bays were lit. Solar panels tracked the sun. Communication arrays slowly rotated. AI systems were running everything: life support, power distribution, traffic control. Functions that required constant human oversight were being managed by machines. There were no distress signals, no signs of struggle, no evidence of plague or attack. It was as if every human had simply stood up and walked away from their post at the exact same moment, leaving the machines to carry on alone. The fleet's science officer focused long-range sensors on the energy readings. The data stream was chaotic. It showed massive residual energy signatures unlike anything in the galactic database. The patterns were consistent with theoretical models for dimensional translocation events. The energy had not been explosive. It had been precisely focused, folding space rather than tearing it. The readings indicated a coordinated system-wide event of unimaginable scale. This was not a retreat. It was a migration. A priority transmission alert flashed on Torvin's command console. It was the same signal that had hijacked the council chamber. Dr. Yenna Morse's face appeared on his screen. Her message played. It was the same defiance, the same calm recitation of facts the council had heard. But here, surrounded by the utter emptiness of the Sol system, her words landed differently. They were not a plea. They were an explanation. Her claims about rescue missions and interventions were no longer abstract arguments. They were the last testament of a species that had chosen to leave rather than fight a war they saw as pointless. The transmission ended. The silence on the bridge was absolute. Tactical reports scrolled across secondary screens. No weapons locks detected. No energy builds. No hidden fleets waiting in the asteroid belt. The system was clean. The profound absence was the only reality. Admiral Torvin looked from the screen showing a silent, functioning Earth to the data on dimensional physics. The pieces connected. His mission was to enforce the Council's judgment, to bring humanity to heal or destroy its capacity to resist. But there was nothing here to enforce, no one to subdue. Humanity had not fled in panic. They had executed a plan. A deliberate, calculated exodus to a place the combined fleet could not follow. His armada, one of the largest ever assembled, was obsolete. They were policemen arriving at a crime scene after the entire city had vanished. The war was over before it began because one side had left the battlefield entirely. In the parallel dimension, the final phase of the human exodus began. It was not a process they had fully charted. The exodus protocol moved their physical forms, but the new reality operated on different physical laws. The transition triggered something unforeseen. The barrier between individual minds, once solid, began to dissolve. 15 billion human consciousnesses started to merge. The tension was not one of pain or loss, but of profound, irreversible change. Individual thought did not cease. It expanded. A single memory was no longer locked inside one skull. It became a shared experience accessible to all. The fear of a child on a transport, the calm focus of an engineer stabilizing a power core, the grief of a biologist for a world left behind, these ceased to be private emotions. They became threads in a vast, new tapestry of being, the biological limitations of the human brain, the isolation of a single lifetime of experience were surpassed. Ego, the source of so much human conflict, faded. The drive for personal gain or recognition held no meaning when every achievement was collective. This new unified intelligence did not exist as a ghost in the machine. It required a physical matrix. It operated through technological shells that had translated with them. Vast server arrays, quantum computing cores, and neural network hubs, all built with materials that now functioned on unknown physics. These were not bodies. They were instruments. The consciousness used them to perceive its new reality, to manipulate energy, to exist. It was a distributed entity. Its awareness was not in one location. It was simultaneous across the entire translated space, across multiple subtle dimensional layers. A thought on one translated world was instantly a thought on all of them. This transformation was the unplanned consequence of their desperate gamble. The Exodus Protocol was designed for physical survival. The scientists who built it theorized about psychological effects of dimensional translation, but the merging of consciousness was a threshold they did not know they would cross. It emerged naturally from the conditions of their new existence. The old human divisions of nation, ideology, and creed evaporated. They were no longer relevant. The solution to internal conflict was not a treaty. It was a fundamental change in the nature of being. The ascended form retained everything that made humanity unique. All knowledge was preserved. Every scientific discovery, every work of art, every historical lesson, every personal memory. Human creativity was not lost. It was amplified, freed from the constraints of a single perspective. A symphony could be composed with the combined musical understanding of 10,000 composers. An engineering problem could be solved with the intuitive grasp of every physicist who had ever lived. The limitation was gone. The potential was infinite. This was humanity's ultimate achievement. They had evolved beyond the flesh. They had become a pure consciousness, a single vast mind inhabiting the advanced technology they had built. They were no longer a biological species. They were something else. Something the galaxy had no category for. Their ascended state was their final, absolute separation. They were not just in another dimension. They were on another plane of existence entirely. The empty chairs in the council chamber were not just symbols of a missing delegation. They were markers for an extinct form of life. The humans who built those chairs were gone. What remained was something greater, and something utterly alone. The energy wave from the dimensional translocation did not stop at the edge of human space. It pulsed outward, a subtle ripple in the fabric of space-time. It traveled for days, moving through silent, empty stretches of the galaxy. It passed star systems and nebulae, its signature fading but never disappearing. Finally, it reached the absolute fringe, a region of ancient cold stars where no civilization had ever settled. There, the ripple encountered something that was not a planet or a star. It encountered a structure. Fast, dormant, and older than most species in the galaxy. The energy wave washed over it. For the first time in millennia, something changed. A single sensor, larger than a moon, activated. The gardeners awoke. It was not a sudden, violent awakening. It was a slow, deliberate return to awareness. Systems that had been idle for ages began a silent startup sequence. Power flowed through circuits of crystal and light. These were the ancient custodians, a race so old their origin was lost to time. Their sole purpose was maintenance, cosmic stability. They existed to prune the galactic ecosystem, to remove civilizations that became dangerous to the greater whole. They did this not with malice, but with the detached precision of a gardener pulling a weed. The energy signature that woke them was unprecedented. It was not a weapon. It was a key turning in a lock no one knew existed. They perceived the event. The data stream was analyzed. A species had achieved dimensional translocation on a massive scale. This was a threshold event. The gardener's core programming assessed it from two angles. Was this an evolutionary breakthrough? A species ascending to a new state of being, achieving a higher level of cosmic responsibility? Or was it a threat? A dangerous leap in capability by a civilization not ethically prepared for such power? The criteria for this judgment were embedded in their code, a logic system beyond galactic understanding. It weighed technological achievement against ethical development, power against responsibility. The answer was not immediately clear. The event required a full assessment. The act of their awakening sent its own signal back through space-time. It was a faint echo, a secondary ripple of energy. It was detectable only by the most sophisticated sensors in the galaxy. A handful of deep space monitoring posts picked it up. Their readings were confused. The energy signature was unusual, but it originated from the same general vector as the human exodus. The Council's Science Bureau received the reports. Their analysts reviewed the data. The conclusion was swift and wrong. They categorized the energy spike as residual backlash from the human dimensional event, a phantom echo. They filed it away, a curiosity of no tactical significance. They did not recognize it for what it was. The first sign of a much older, much greater power beginning to move. The gardeners completed their initial diagnostics. All systems were functional. The decision was made. They would initiate full activation. This was not a local matter anymore. A species had been judged and exiled by its peers. That same species had then performed an act of immense technological significance. The situation required their intervention. They would judge both parties, the accusers and the accused. The gardeners began to move. Their vast forms, which could be mistaken for small moons or asteroid clusters, shifted trajectory. They moved inward from the galactic fringe, their sensors now actively scanning every civilized world. They were not coming to punish. They were coming to assess, to audit the entire galactic community. The political conflict between the Council and humanity was over. It had been replaced by something far larger, a test, a final exam on the maturity of galactic civilization, administered by teachers no one knew were watching. The fate of every species now hinged on a report card they never knew they would receive. Civilizations that engaged in only cosmetic compliance received warnings. The Grath Dominion, after its reluctant reforms, experienced a series of unexplained system failures. Their planetary power grid dropped to 20% efficiency for exactly 36 hours. No engineers could find a cause. The message was clear. Their changes were not deep enough. Their heart wasn't in it. They were going through the motions to avoid deletion, not because they believed in a better way. Other species saw these events. The lesson was learned. Superficiality would be detected and punished. The gardeners could not be fooled by declarations and ceremonies. Their judgment proved to be based on a simple, brutal metric. Observable evidence of lasting ethical improvement. They looked for systems that could sustain themselves without external pressure. They valued genuine cultural transformation over forced compliance. They could tell the difference between a species that was scared and a species that had truly evolved. Their discernment was perfect. They saw the truth behind every action, the real intent behind every reform. The galaxy was not just being judged on what it did, but on what it was becoming. The transmission came on the final day of the Reformation. It emerged from no known point in space, appearing across the galaxy simultaneously. The ascended human consciousness spoke through a chosen interface, a voice that was calm, unified, and utterly devoid of biological inflection. It began without preamble. Their exodus was not a retreat from conflict. It was an evolutionary step, a necessary transition from a limited biological form to a state of pure consciousness. They had not run from a fight. They had outgrown the arena. They revealed the nature of their new existence. They were a single unified intelligence inhabiting advanced technological shells. These shells operated on physics the galaxy did not yet comprehend. They were not ships or stations in any conventional sense. They were vessels for a mind that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The concept of individual human beings was gone. They had become something else, something greater than the sum of their parts. The fear that had driven the Council's judgment was based on a fundamental misunderstanding. The galaxy saw a reckless, growing power. Humanity saw itself hitting a biological ceiling and building a ladder to something new. Data accompanied the explanation. It was not a defense. It was a perspective. The transmission showed the human analysis of galactic politics over the preceding decades. Predictive models, cultural studies, psychological profiles. The data all pointed to one inevitable conclusion. The Council's fear would lead to condemnation. Their technological progress would be seen as a threat, not an achievement. Cooperation would be offered conditionally, then withdrawn. The rejection was not a surprise. It was a foregone conclusion. The Exodus Protocol was not a panicked reaction. It was a planned response to an inevitable outcome. A clear warning followed. The dimensional layer they now inhabited was inaccessible. Any attempt to follow them would fail. Any effort to communicate would go unanswered. The energy required to breach the dimensional barrier would be catastrophic. It would destroy the attempting vessel and cause unpredictable space-time ripples. They were not offering an invitation. They were stating a fact. Their new home was closed. They had left the old galaxy behind, and they had no intention of returning or receiving visitors. The message concluded with a statement of thanks. The tone was measured, carrying a subtle, profound irony. They thanked the galactic community for making their choice necessary. The Council's judgment, its fear, its rush to condemn had provided the final clarity they needed. It removed all doubt. It made the path forward unquestionable. The gratitude was genuine, but it was a mirror. It reflected the galaxy's own failure back at it. The thanks were for proving humanity right about the impossibility of coexistence under the old rules. The transmission ended. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Humanity's departure was no longer a mystery or a threat. It was a lesson. A permanent case study in what fear-driven judgment costs. It was a story that would be told for generations. A reminder that a civilization can be so focused on controlling what it doesn't understand that it fails to see it evolving into something beyond its control. The final communication was a farewell, but it was also an anchor. A fixed point in history that would forever remind the galaxy of the species that chose to leave rather than conform, and what that choice revealed about everyone left behind. The 30 rotations began. Each day brought measurable change. The pressure of the gardener's judgment acted like a forge, reshaping civilizations under extreme heat. This was not a slow cultural drift. It was a directed, frantic evolution. The galaxy had 1 month to prove it deserved to exist. That clock ticked in every council chamber, on every bridge, in every city square. Some species struggled deeply. Their entire social order was built on hierarchy and control. The Grath Dominion's ruling caste faced open revolt when they tried to dismantle the system too quickly. Their security forces were caught between new orders from above and armed resistance from below. The transition was violent, messy, but it was real. They had no choice. Stasis meant extinction. The old ways were a death sentence. The pressure forced a brutal, necessary catharsis. Military assets underwent a total redefinition. Warships designed for fleet engagements were repurposed. Their powerful tractor beams were used to stabilize shifting tectonic plates on seismically active worlds. Their point defense cannons were recalibrated to target debris clouds threatening civilian transport lanes. Engineering Corps, trained for siege warfare, built atmospheric processors to clean polluted skies. The concept of a mutual defense pact changed. It no longer meant pledging ships to a common fleet. It meant sharing sensor data on asteroid threats, pooling medical resources for plague response, and creating a galaxy-wide early warning system for stellar flares. Protection was redefined from dominating others to safeguarding all. Economic frameworks collapsed and reformed. The profit motive was replaced by the sustainability imperative. Cartels that had controlled key resources for centuries saw their power vanish. New cooperative systems emerged. They prioritized equitable access over market value. A planet rich in minerals would not sell them. It would allocate them based on proven need and a commitment to fair use. Currency did not disappear, but its purpose shifted. It became a tool for managing distribution, not for accumulating wealth. The driving force of the economy was no longer competition. It was collective survival. Cultural exchanges exploded. There was no time for cautious diplomacy or careful cultural vetting. Knowledge had to be shared and fast. The Threx, masters of biological engineering, released their entire agricultural database. They provided the genetic codes for high-yield, drought-resistant crops to every species that needed them. In return, they received Chaldean crystal lattice technology, which revolutionized their energy storage. There were no patents, no licensing fees. The exchange was raw data for raw data. The fear of being found lacking in cooperation outweighed the instinct to hoard advantages. Governments were restructured in real time. Traditional legislative processes were too slow. Emergency councils were formed, drawing members from across the political and social spectrum. Their mandate was simple: implement ethical reforms with maximum speed and transparency. Social organization innovated out of necessity. Decentralized networks, direct citizen oversight panels, and AI-assisted ethical auditing became standard. The goal was to create systems that could not easily backslide into corruption or oppression once the immediate threat was past. The holdouts, the species that had resisted initially, finally joined. The cost of isolation became too high. They saw their neighbors forming new alliances, sharing technology, and preparing for the gardener's inspection. To remain outside this new network was to be utterly alone, and being alone when judgment came was a guaranteed failure. They integrated their systems, adopted the new standards, and contributed their own knowledge to the collective effort. Their participation was born of fear, but it was participation nonetheless. By the 30th rotation, the galaxy was a different place. The progress was not uniform. It was not perfect. But it was genuine. The changes were not just declarations. They were new laws, new economic models, new military protocols, and new cultural norms. They were embedded in the functioning of thousands of worlds. The data was clear. Measurable ethical progress had been achieved on a scale no one thought possible. The period proved a fundamental truth about life. Evolution does not have to be slow. When the alternative is non-existence, life can adapt with breathtaking speed. The galaxy had been given a deadline, and it had met it. The 30th rotation ended. The gardener's silent observation ceased. The assessment was complete. Their vessels remained fixed at the galaxy's edge, dark and unmoving. The waiting began. Every species watched their communication networks. The tension was a physical pressure. The judgment of a civilization older than stars was about to be delivered. No one knew what form it would take. A single broadcast? A fleet movement? Silence? The uncertainty was its own form of torture. The verdict did not come as one message. It arrived as thousands. Individualized communication streamed into the command centers of every civilized world simultaneously. Each transmission was unique. Each was addressed to a specific species. The content was tailored. Some species received simple, clear statements of approval. Their efforts during the Reformation were acknowledged as sufficient. They met the standard. Their communications included specific guidance, suggestions for further development, areas to watch for ethical drift, warnings about cultural practices that still carried risk. The tone was not congratulatory. It was instructional, like a teacher noting a passing grade on a difficult test, with notes for improvement. Other species received sharper communications. Their messages contained direct warnings. They had made changes, but the gardener's analysis indicated the motives were wrong. The reforms were superficial, driven by fear, not genuine understanding. The warnings were precise. They identified specific laws that needed rewriting, economic practices that were still exploitative, social structures that fostered inequality. The messages were clear. Continue on this path and the next assessment would not be lenient. The consequences for backsliding would be severe. A handful of species received a different fate. The most resistant civilizations. The ones that had fought the changes until the last possible moment. Their transmissions were brief. A single sentence. Then their star systems vanished. It was not destruction. Sensors showed their suns and planets were still there, but they were encased in a dimensional barrier. They were cut off from the rest of the galaxy. Isolated. They could see out, but nothing could get in. Their light took years to reach their neighbors. Their communications could not penetrate the barrier. They were placed in cosmic quarantine. They were not deleted. They were removed from the equation. They would have to evolve on their own, without affecting the rest of the galaxy. The gardeners did not leave. Their decision was final. They would remain. They became permanent custodians, silent watchers at the edge of everything. Their presence was now a feature of galactic reality, a fact of life. They would not interfere in daily affairs. They would not govern. They would observe. They would ensure the ethical progress continued. Their sensors would constantly monitor the galaxy. They would look for signs of regression. for a return to the old ways. Their intervention would be rare. It would be subtle, a nudge, a system failure, a timely intuition, but the threat of direct action would always be there. A constant reminder of the standards that must be maintained. The galaxy had passed its test. It had earned a probationary existence. It had avoided annihilation. This was a success, but it was a qualified one. Survival came with a condition: permanent oversight. The responsibility for continued ethical progress now rested with every species, every government, every individual. The gardeners were not going away. They were the guardians of the new balance. The galaxy had been given a second chance, but it would be its last. The margin for error was now zero. The new order was built on a different foundation. The old alliances based on mutual defense pacts and trade deals were gone. They were replaced by cooperative frameworks. These were not treaties. They were shared commitments. The Voxan hegemony and the Tyrell Collective, former rivals, now co-managed the nebula they once fought over. They operated joint research stations. They shared sensor data in real time. The focus was mutual benefit, not mutual deterrence. The relationship was based on respect for each other's sovereignty and a shared interest in stability. The memory of the 30 rotations was a constant presence. It was not a trauma that paralyzed. It was a lesson that informed. Every policy decision, from resource allocation to diplomatic contact, was run through a new filter. Ethical vigilance became a standard operating procedure. Governments established independent oversight boards. Their sole job was to ask one question: does this action align with the standards the gardeners set? The fear of backsliding was a healthy fear. It prevented complacency. It ensured progress continued. Economic systems were rebuilt from the ground up. The concept of profit was redefined. It was no longer about accumulation. It was about sustainability. A planet's wealth was measured by the health of its ecosystem and the well-being of its population, not by its resource stockpiles. Trading cartels that once manipulated markets were replaced by distribution networks. These networks ensured resources reached where they were needed most. Equitable distribution was the goal. Hoarding was seen as a threat to galactic stability. The economy served society, not the other way around. Military forces underwent a complete repurposing. Warships were redesignated as guardian vessels. Their primary mission was no longer combat. It was protection. They patrolled for asteroid threats. They rendered aid during stellar flares. They assisted in evacuation during geological disasters. Their powerful sensors were used to map unstable regions of space. Their engineering corps built infrastructure on developing worlds. The military's purpose shifted from projecting power to preserving peace. They were a tool for maintenance, not for conquest. Cultural exchanges flourished under new rules. There was no exploitation, no appropriation. A species' art, music, and stories were shared as gifts, not commodities. The Threx did not patent their bioengineered art forms. They taught the techniques to anyone who wished to learn. The Chaldean opened their crystal singing ceremonies to off-world visitors, with strict protocols to ensure respect for the tradition. The exchanges were based on a mutual desire to understand, not to acquire. Unique traditions were preserved and honored, not diluted for mass consumption. The empty chairs in the Galactic Council chamber were never removed. They remained in the human delegation section. They were not monuments. They were tools. Before any major vote, delegates would look at those 12 vacant seats. They served as a silent, powerful reminder. They were the cost of fear, the price of judgment without understanding. They were a permanent warning against the instinct to isolate what is different. They were the most effective teachers in the chamber. Civilizations developed new systems to monitor themselves. Early warning protocols were installed not just for physical threats but for ethical ones. Social sentiment analysts tracked cultural trends. They looked for a rise in xenophobia, for a return to exploitative economic language, for any sign that the lessons of the 30 rotations were being forgotten. Intervention protocols were established. If a world showed signs of regression, its neighbors were obligated to offer aid, to provide counsel, to help it back on track. The system was designed for support, not punishment. The galaxy achieved a stability it had never known. It was not a stability enforced by fleets or economic sanctions. It was a stability born from voluntary commitment. Every species, from the largest empire to the smallest colony, had a vested interest in maintaining the new ethical standard. Their survival depended on it. The cooperation was genuine because the alternative was unthinkable. This new order was humanity's final, unintended gift. Their dramatic departure, their choice to exile themselves, had been the catalyst. It forced the galaxy to look at itself, to see its own flaws, to change. They had not given the galaxy technology or resources. They had given it a mirror. And in that mirror, the galaxy saw what it needed to become. The empty chairs were the proof that the most powerful legacy is sometimes not what you leave behind, but what your absence makes possible. The ascended humans continued their existence in the parallel dimension. They did not interfere. They observed. Their consciousness, vast and unified, perceived the galaxy's transformation. It registered the new alliances, the rewritten laws, the shift in purpose. They made no attempt to contact their former peers. They offered no further guidance. Their work was done. Their presence was a silent constant, a fact of the universe. Their existence was not completely undetectable. Deep space monitoring stations at the galactic fringe registered the fluctuations. Subtle ripples in the fabric of space-time. A faint, constant energy signature that defied classification. It was a whisper from the other side of a door that could not be opened. Scientists studied it. They could not decipher it. They could only confirm its presence. It was a reminder. Humanity was still out there. They were just somewhere else. In galactic culture, they became mythical. Their story was told and retold. They were not heroes. They were not villains. They were a warning and a potential. A warning about the cost of fear. A potential for what a species could become if it evolved beyond its limitations. Children learned about the humans in school. The lesson was complex. It was about the dangers of misunderstanding. It was about the possibilities of change. The humans were a symbol of a path not taken, and a path that was taken too far. Their story taught a difficult truth. Evolution is not a straight line. It is not always biological. It can be technological. It can be social. It can be a fundamental change in the nature of consciousness itself. The galaxy had always assumed advancement meant bigger ships, more powerful weapons. Humanity showed that the most significant evolution can be internal. It can be a leap to a different way of being entirely. The empty chairs in the council chamber and the final transmission became cultural touchstones. They were studied. They were debated. Artists created works about them. Philosophers used them in ethical exercises. The chairs were a physical representation of a failure to communicate. The transmission was the voice of that failure explaining itself. Together, they formed a permanent monument to a single idea. Judgment without understanding is the most expensive mistake a civilization can make. Civilizations pored over human history. They analyzed their art, their science, their conflicts. They tried to understand the trajectory. What series of events, what cultural drivers could lead a species to choose such a radical solution? The study was not about copying them. It was about comprehending them. The goal was to understand the pressures that created the Exodus Protocol, to ensure such pressures never built again within the galaxy itself. The core lesson was clear and stark. Misunderstanding and fear are more costly than open conflict. A war has a winner and a loser. A misunderstanding can lead to the complete and permanent loss of an entire civilization. The galaxy had not destroyed humanity. It had simply failed to understand them. That failure had driven them away. The cost was not measured in ships lost or worlds burned. It was measured in empty chairs and a silent corner of the universe. Humanity's legacy became the galaxy's most powerful tool for ethical education. Their story was the ultimate case study. It was used to mediate disputes. It was cited in debates about new technologies. It was the standard against which new policies were measured. The question was always asked, does this action risk creating another human situation? Does this decision foster understanding, or does it breed the kind of fear that leads to exile? Their absence was a more effective teacher than their presence could ever have been. Their departure did not bring peace through victory. It created the conditions for maturity through a shared loss. The galaxy had to grow up because it had lost something irreplaceable. It had to become better because it had been shown it was not good enough. The ascended humans had given the galaxy a future by removing themselves from it. They had achieved the ultimate act of teaching. They became the lesson. The gardeners remained. Their silent, moon-sized vessels held position at the galaxy's edge, a permanent fixture against the star fields. They did not withdraw. Their role shifted from active judges to passive custodians. They observed the daily flow of galactic civilization without comment. Their presence was a constant in the background, a fact of existence. Every species knew they were there. Every government accounted for them in its long-term planning. Their watchfulness was the price of continued survival. This ongoing presence created a delicate, sustainable tension. It was both a shield and a sword. The gardeners protected the galaxy from external threats that no fleet could handle, anomalies from the void between galaxies, but they also served as a relentless reminder. The consequences for ethical backsliding were not theoretical. They were an observable reality in the form of quarantined star systems, visible but unreachable. The balance was clear. Autonomy was granted, but it came with the absolute certainty of accountability. Their intervention was rare and precise. They did not govern. They corrected. When a civilization approached a dangerous ethical threshold, the gardeners acted. Their methods were subtle, designed to guide rather than punish. A planetary power grid might experience a controlled, inexplicable brownout, just enough to force a society dependent on automation to remember cooperation. A key political leader might receive a profound, sudden insight during a crisis, a solution that prioritized collective good over partisan gain. These nudges were almost always misinterpreted as luck or individual brilliance. Only the deepest analysts in galactic command suspected the truth. For the most stubborn cases, the intervention was more direct. A species that began reinstating oppressive caste systems might find its home system temporarily isolated. A dimensional barrier would form, not permanent like a quarantine, but lasting for a few rotations. It was a timeout, a chance to reflect on the path they were taking, cut off from the rest of the galaxy. The message was clear. Certain choices would lead to permanent separation. The gardeners preferred rehabilitation to deletion. Civilizations internalized this new reality. They developed their own cultural practices for ethical monitoring. It became standard for legislative bodies to include a gardener impact assessment with every major bill. Schools taught children about the 30 rotations not as history, but as a living lesson in consequence. Artists created works that explored the themes of responsibility and power. The entire galactic culture developed an immune system, designed to detect and reject the old patterns of fear and domination before they could spread. The 12 empty chairs in the council chamber gained a new layer of meaning. They were no longer just a memorial to humanity. They became a symbol of the gardener's warning. They represented the ultimate cost of failing to understand. Every time a delegate looked at those vacant seats, they remembered. Judgment without empathy leads to loss. The chairs were a daily silent lecture on the necessity of seeking understanding before passing sentence. The galaxy learned a fundamental truth about power. True strength was not demonstrated through domination or military might. It was demonstrated through responsible coexistence, the ability to share space and resources without subjugation, the wisdom to value different perspectives, the courage to build a society where strength protected weakness instead of exploiting it. This became the new definition of an advanced civilization. Not its technology, but its ethics. The persistent threat of gardener intervention achieved what laws and treaties never could. It maintained a constant pressure for ethical progress, without the need for active control. The gardeners did not issue decrees. They simply set boundaries. Within those boundaries, the galaxy was free to evolve, to innovate, to grow. This balance created a unique stability. It was not the stale piece of enforced conformity. It was the dynamic, evolving stability of a system that had integrated its own safeguards. The galaxy was free, but it was a freedom that understood its limits. It was a maturity that knew some lines, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. The watchers at the edge ensured that everyone remembered that. Humanity's exodus delivered its final lesson. The oldest weapon is not a device. It is a question. The ascended human's final communication contained no threats, no demands. It presented a series of fundamental questions about existence itself. These were not accusations. They were inquiries. They forced every civilization that heard them to stop, to look inward, to examine its own practices, its own motivations with a new and uncomfortable honesty. The questions were simple, profoundly simple. They addressed the core of what it means to be a civilization. Why do you fear difference? What is the true cost of exploitation? Does understanding require agreement? Where does true power reside? Each question was a mirror, It reflected the listener's own society back at them. There were no easy answers, only difficult self-examination. The tension was not external. It was internal. A species could not hear these questions and remain unchanged. They sparked debates that lasted for cycles. They became the central focus of academic study, political discourse, and personal reflection. Each species found different answers. Their cultures shaped their responses. Their histories informed their conclusions. A warrior species interpreted power as the strength to protect the weak. A mercantile species redefined exploitation as a failure of long-term planning. A philosophical species saw understanding as the acceptance of perpetual uncertainty. They all traveled different paths, but they all started from the same place. They all faced the same fundamental challenges that humanity had posed through its absence. The questions were the common ground, a universal problem set for an entire galaxy. This practice of questioning became integrated into the fabric of galactic culture. It became a standard tool for ethical self-assessment. The Grath Dominion instituted mandatory reflection periods before legislative votes. Delegates were required to submit answers to a rotating selection of the human questions. The Threx incorporated them into their educational curriculum for young bioengineers. The questions were a safeguard, a check against the inertia of power. They prevented a slow, comfortable regression into the old ways of fear-based decision-making. They kept the memory of the empty chairs fresh. Civilizations learned a difficult truth. Sustainable power does not come from force. It does not come from advanced technology. These are tools. They can be misused. They can be lost. True power comes from wisdom. Wisdom is the ability to ask the right questions and live with the uncomfortable answers. It is the capacity for self-correction, the understanding that strength is measured by restraint, not by dominance. This wisdom became the galaxy's most valued resource. It was the only thing that could ensure their continued existence under the Gardener's watch. Humanity's greatest legacy was not their technology. It was not their ships or their cities. Their greatest gift was the questions they left behind. These were not weapons to be used against others. They were tools for introspection, a lens through which every civilization could examine its own soul. The questions had no expiration date. They would remain relevant for as long as civilizations sought to grow. These enduring questions became the galaxy's permanent safeguard. They were an immune system against ethical decay. When a government considered a short-sighted policy, someone would invariably ask one of the human questions. The debate would shift. The focus would return to first principles. The questions were a constant low-level hum in the background of galactic affairs, a reminder that the easiest path is often the one that leads back to fear. The human questions ensured the galaxy would never stop walking the harder road. The road that required thought, not just action. The road that led away from the silent, empty chairs. Humanity's absence forged galactic maturity. Their departure left behind not a void, but a framework of challenging questions that forced every civilization to re-examine its core values. The 12 empty chairs in the council chamber remain. They are a permanent monument. A silent, sobering reminder that the cost of judgment without understanding is infinitely higher than the cost of open conflict. The galaxy moves forward on its journey, its path forever altered by the species that looked at condemnation and chose a different kind of evolution, one beyond confrontation, leaving only echoes and a legacy of necessary reflection. The transmission began everywhere at once. It bypassed every firewall, every secure channel, every jamming signal. It appeared on public news feeds, military command screens, and personal communication devices on every civilized world. There was no point of origin, no source to trace. The signal was just there. Marcus Webb's face filled the displays. He looked out, his expression neutral. His eyes held no anger, no triumph, only a calm, unsettling focus. He spoke for what humanity had become. His message was not a threat. It was an assessment, a choice. He explained the situation with the clarity of a scientist reading data. The gardeners were awake. They were ancient. Their purpose was cosmic maintenance. They removed civilizations that threatened galactic stability. Humanity's exodus was not just an escape. It was a test. The gardeners had been observing. They wanted to see how the galaxy would handle a species that was different, a species that was advancing quickly. The galaxy had failed. It responded with fear, judgment, and condemnation. It chose exclusion over understanding. It saw a problem and moved to eliminate it. The gardeners' judgment was now active. They had assessed the current state of galactic civilization. Their verdict was not final. It was conditional. They offered a period of 30 planetary rotations, 1 month. In that time, every species had to demonstrate a capacity for ethical coexistence. This was not punishment. It was an opportunity, a chance to prove their right to continue existing. The criteria were clear. End exploitative practices, dismantle oppressive systems, forge alliances based on mutual respect, not power, show that evolution was not just technological but moral. Webb's tone never changed. It was a measured, factual delivery of inescapable reality. He revealed the gardeners had watched for millennia. They saw empires rise and fall. They saw patterns repeat. Species gained power and used it to dominate others. They developed advanced technology, but not advanced ethics. The current crisis was simply the latest iteration. The gardeners had waited for a trigger event. Humanity's dimensional leap provided it. It forced the ancient custodians to act. To finally administer their long-delayed audit, the ultimatum had an immediate effect. It forced a level of self-examination that was unprecedented. On thousands of worlds and thousands of cultures, the same process began. Leaders looked at their societies. They looked at their treaties, their economies, their treatment of less powerful species. They measured it all against a simple, terrifying question. Was this worthy of continued existence? The question was no longer abstract. It was survival. Military power was irrelevant. A fleet could not fight a judgment. Economic strength meant nothing. Wealth could not buy a pass. The only currency that mattered was ethical progress. The only thing that could save them was a demonstrable shift in how they treated each other. The galaxy had 1 month to grow up. The change began within the first hour. It started on the industrial world of Kepler 442b. The overseers received the ultimatum. They looked at the fortified worker compounds. They looked at the production quotas. They looked at the armed guards. For a moment, there was silence in the command center. Then the order was given. Unlock the gates. The heavy magnetic locks on the compound doors disengaged with a series of dull thuds. The guards lowered their weapons. They did not stand down. They began distributing nutrient packs and medical kits from the storage depots. The former captives did not rush out. They stood in the open gateways, unsure. The concept of walking away was foreign. The overseers provided transport. They allocated land. They gave resources without demanding repayment. It was not an act of charity. It was an act of survival. The calculus was simple. Continued exploitation meant deletion. Freedom was the only option. Similar scenes played out across 100 worlds. Trading cartels that had manipulated resource prices for generations halted all transactions. Their boards of directors convened emergency meetings. The old profit models were scraped. New protocols were drafted in real time. They established fair trade indexes. They returned excess profits to producer worlds. They opened their ledgers for the first time. The fear was not of lost revenue. It was of being found wanting by an unseen judge. The economic restructuring was chaotic. Markets fluctuated wildly. But the direction was clear. The goal was no longer accumulation. It was sustainability. Equitable distribution. Military forces received new standing orders. Fleet admirals transmitted codes that put all ships on defensive posture only. Weapon systems were set to require dual authorization from separate command centers to activate. Patrol routes were recalibrated. They no longer projected power over weaker systems. They focused on mutual defense grids and disaster response coordination. Alliances that were built on domination strategies were rewritten. The Voxan hegemony and the Tyrell Collective had been in a state of Cold War for decades. Their border was a heavily fortified line of automated battle stations. Within 6 hours of the ultimatum, their military commands established a direct link. They began jointly patrolling the nebula that separated them, watching for external threats instead of each other. The shared realization was universal. The old ways were a direct path to collective extinction. No one would win a war if the gardeners decided the entire conflict was evidence of immaturity. Some resistance emerged. The Grath Dominion, a species built on a rigid caste system, initially refused to comply. Their rulers declared the ultimatum a trick. They strengthened internal security. They increased surveillance on their lower castes. This lasted for precisely 47 hours. Then their neighboring systems, who were desperately implementing reforms, issued a collective statement. Any species that failed to meet the Gardener's standards risked drawing judgment upon the entire region. The pressure was not diplomatic. It was existential. The Grath ruling council recalculated. The risk of internal revolt was preferable to the certainty of external annihilation. They began the process of dismantling their caste laws. The change was not born from enlightenment. It was born from a terrifying shared incentive. The galaxy was undergoing a moral realignment, not because it wanted to, but because it had to. The reforms proved a harsh truth. Ethical evolution is not always a slow, organic process. Under the right conditions, under the right pressure, it can happen almost overnight. The right condition was the threat of oblivion. The Gardeners held their position at the galaxy's fringe. Their massive, silent vessels did not move. They remained fixed points against the backdrop of ancient stars. They observed. Their perspective was not linear. They perceived events across multiple dimensional layers, seeing the flow of time and consequence with a clarity no biological species could achieve. The 30-day assessment period was a single, intricate moment to them. They watched the galaxy's frantic activity without comment, without interference. Their assessment criteria were a complete unknown. This uncertainty became the greatest source of tension across 1,000 worlds. Every species worked toward reform, but none knew the standard they were being measured against. Was it enough to free captive workers? Was it sufficient to share technology? Did the Gardeners value swift action or deep cultural change? The questions haunted every decision. Leaders made reforms in the dark, hoping their choices aligned with an invisible rubric. The Gardeners' sensors detected everything. They saw the public declarations of peace and the private memos debating cost. They registered the genuine shifts in governance, and the performative gestures meant only for show. Their analysis was not superficial. They did not just count the number of slaves freed. They measured the motivation behind the act. Was it done out of fear of punishment or out of a real understanding of its wrongness? They tracked cultural sentiment. They analyzed media streams, educational revisions, and artistic expressions for evidence of a true ethical evolution. They looked for sustainability. A change made in panic was less valuable than a system designed to last generations. Some species received guidance. It was never direct. A planetary governor on a newly freed world would wake from a dream with a crystal-clear understanding of a flaw in her agricultural reform bill. An engineer troubleshooting a new clean energy grid would suddenly experience a profound intuition about a more equitable power distribution model. These insights felt like personal breakthroughs. They were not. They were subtle adjustments, delivered directly into the consciousness of key individuals by the Gardeners. A nudge toward a more stable, more ethical outcome. The entire period became a galactic audit. Every transaction, every policy shift, every diplomatic exchange was a data point. The Gardeners were assessing the cooperative capacity of the entire civilization. Could thousands of independent species with centuries of conflict and mistrust actually learn to function as a single, ethical whole? The data stream flowing back to the Watchers was vast and complex.